At this time, I'd like to introduce NCTL's Vice President, Claire Kaplan, who is the lead author of Time for Teachers. And she oversees our knowledge management operation and has been instrumental in leading NCTL's efforts and initiatives over the last 10 years. She previously led her own consulting practice, served as vice president at the Initiative for Inner City, Competitive Inner City, and one of her first jobs out of college was working in a small Chicago youth-serving nonprofit with none other than Arnie Duncan. Claire is going to review the report's findings. Before she comes up, I also want to thank the other members of the NCTL team who wrote and researched this important new report: Roy Chan, David Fardman, Amy Novarita, and Amy Stahl, who's here today. It was an extraordinary job researching, identifying, and documenting the practices of these 17 schools. And this report would not have been possible without the support of the Joyce Foundation. Jason Canera was planning to be here today. Jason, are you here? Great. Jason, thanks for being here today. He's a senior program officer for education at the Joyce Foundation. We really appreciated your input along the way and the foundation's support. And I also want to thank the Ford Foundation, the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation, the Carnegie and Kellogg Foundations for their support of our knowledge management work and NCTL overall. Claire?
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me just start by saying that working on this report was a real privilege for our team because it allowed us to go into some really amazing schools and to meet with some incredible leaders and teachers. So we're very grateful to the schools that are featured here in the report for opening their doors to us and spending time with us and teaching us about the amazing things happening in those schools. And I also just want to reiterate Jennifer's recognition to the team at NCTL. This was a real team effort, and it wouldn't have been possible without the long hours each and every member of the team put in to make it happen. So as Jennifer said, at the National Center on Time and Learning, we've been working for 7 years now with expanded time schools and have been deeply aware of the benefit that this expanded time has had, not just for students, but also for teachers. And we wanted to explore that more deeply by digging in to a set of really strong schools and understanding how they're using that time. So we started out by looking for schools across the country. We have a geographic sample represented, diverse sample across 13 states. We looked for schools that were showing high growth or high performance, were showing strong teacher practices that we could learn from, and of course had expanded time for all students. And just to give you a sense of that, at the bottom here you see these schools on average, they're very different, but on average they have 250 more hours of school per year for all students. And that translates really to about 7.5 weeks of additional school time. So one of the things that is most interesting about the schools is the way that they are able to create schedules that offer both more time for students as well as for teachers. So in the pie chart here on the left, you see the time allocations and proportion for typical schools in the US. In those schools, we know from various staffing surveys that teachers spend more than 80% of their time directly in front of students, so in direct instruction. Once you take into account time for lunch and other duties in the school, there's very little time left over then for deep work on improving instruction, for meeting with colleagues, for reviewing data. By contrast, if you look at the pie chart on the right, which shows time allocations at these 17 study schools, we were really struck by how different this proportion looks. There's twice as much time for these teachers in these schools to work with their colleagues, to think about how they can improve their practice, and to really plan deeply for the work they're doing. What's also interesting about this difference is that the high-performing nations in Europe and in Asia that are outperforming the US on many measures of student learning look more like our Time for Teachers schools. The proportion of instructional time to time with colleagues looks more like the pie chart on the right. And I think that means a lot to us, and means that we really need to look more at this issue of how we balance time in the classroom and time outside the classroom. So, of course, just making the time for teachers is only half of the battle. The key is to make that time purposeful and useful and effective. And so we looked at 6 practices. We discovered 6 practices across these schools. And I'm just going to go briefly into each of them, but of course they're detailed in more in the report with examples from each of the schools. And we also identify a number of keys to success for implementing each of these practices in the report. And those are important, again, because these are the implementation factors that make all of these practices work so well. So the first, collaborative lesson planning. Teachers are spending a lot of time together to think about how to teach the standards, how to teach the materials, and how to meet student learning goals. They're spending time in embedded professional development that is school-based. It's rooted very much and relevant to what teachers are doing every day and what their students need, and is very different from what might be prepackaged external professional development that we might think of more typically. Teachers are coming back in the summer before 2 to 3 weeks before students start in the fall, and they're spending time planning and reflecting and thinking about how to gear up for the year ahead. They're spending tremendous amount of time in data analysis, whether it's in weekly data meetings or in periodic data days where they're reviewing results from benchmark assessments. And this is the time where they're really measuring how are students learning and how are we meeting the goals that we have for them, and do we need to adapt our instruction and think differently about how we're teaching. They've got very developed systems for coaching. Teachers have assigned coaches where someone is watching and is coming in and observing them in the classroom and then sitting down and providing feedback on their instruction and really working with them on specific goals. And then we saw systems for peer observation, allowing teachers to come into other teachers' classrooms and learn for their peers to see how a specific teacher is modeling a particular instructional practice. And all of these practices really work together to create a whole system of professional development that has been so effective in each of the schools. I don't have time to go into each of them, but I'll spend just a minute talking about one of the practices, and that's collaborative planning. And it really struck me when I visited the schools, because I think we think of teaching as a very individual practice sometimes. We think of a teacher in front of a classroom, going home, preparing for that class, and then coming back the next day and teaching. At these schools, we saw lesson planning as a team process. It was a very collaborative endeavor where teachers were taking the standards for student learning and together translating them into lesson plans that would be the most effective. And they were building off of each teacher's diverse experience and expertise and creating the plans that would really best meet student learning needs. And then they were coming back often and thinking, how well did that work? How well did we meet the standards? And can we improve on what we did? Just a quick look at how this looks in one of the schools. This is a schedule from the Sylvia Elementary School in Fall River, Massachusetts. As you can see, there's an 8-hour school day, and there's a typical 3rd grade teacher schedule. This schedule allows teachers to have two common planning periods a week devoted to working together and doing lesson planning. One of those is focused on math and one is focused on literacy. But what's so important about that is it doesn't cut into student learning time. Students are productively engaged in specials during one of those periods where they're in gym or in music or art. And then in another period, they're doing social emotional learning and anti-bullying curriculum with a specialist teacher, allowing the teacher to be freed up. And it also doesn't cut into teacher individual prep time. Teachers at this school still have 5 prep periods a week to work together. As I mentioned, we have keys to success identified for each of the practices. I won't go into all of these, but to give you an example, we learned through these schools that for example, that collaborative planning works best when there are very clear goals for what teachers are doing together. So if they're planning 3 lessons that will be delivered the next week, the teachers are very clear on what the outcomes are for their time together, and this makes the practice work in the school. We also identified 3 themes across these practices that I want to mention briefly today. One is that the time that schools were investing in professional learning was really deepened and strengthened by a professional culture across the schools. We saw a culture that embraced feedback, that focused on continuous improvement, and really enhanced efforts to collaborate. We saw abundant opportunities for teachers to serve as leaders in their schools, whether it was running data meetings, serving as department heads. Teachers were really taking ownership for the instruction within the school. And then the school was truly the locus of learning. The professional development was very rooted in school goals and what students and teachers needed. In addition to identifying a number of practices, we also wanted to highlight some recommendations for the field, for policymakers and practitioners. And I definitely don't have time to go into all of these. They're detailed more in the report, but I'll just mention a couple of them. First and foremost, and most obviously probably, is the need to advance expanded time policies. We need to think of teacher time as a lever for improving teacher effectiveness, and we need to think about ways that we can provide more schools and teachers with this time. We need to also think about how to make our funding mechanisms for professional development focused on incentivizing the wide variety of professional learning opportunities that we saw in these schools, all 6 of those types of practices. For practitioners, really the whole report is very much focused on practitioners and providing recommendations, but I'll highlight a couple of things. In the second bullet, redesigning schedules to add collaboration time. We saw very innovative schedules across these schools, schedules that really allowed for both more learning time for students and more learning time for teachers. And we know that school leaders really need to think creatively and innovatively about that schedule to make that happen. And then also just want to highlight the need for instructional leaders. We saw across these schools, whether it was the principal, an assistant principal, a dean of instruction, or teacher leaders themselves, serving and deeply engaged in instructional leadership, helping to support all of these practices to take shape and committed to professional learning. So again, this is just a brief overview. Obviously, more of this is detailed in the report, but I know I'm out of time, and we'd certainly want to make time for the panels and to hear from the practitioners themselves. So I'm going to turn this back over to Jennifer.